Ladies and gentlemen, it's so great to see so many people come out to support Jim on the launch of his book, which we're so excited to publish at University of Regina Press. I'm thrilled today to have James Daschuk with us, who is in fact the author of this book.
Well, thanks, Bruce.
So when I've been talking about this, I've been kind of reducing it down to that one piece of the story, which is the story of our first Prime Minister. But the book actually covers a lot of things. If we could sort of step back, if you could tell me the broader story, what else does it talk about?
Sure. Well, I got onto this topic about at least 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago now, as a young graduate student at University of Manitoba. And what I set out to do was to identify the gap between the health of mainstream Canadians and the health or poor health of Indigenous Canadians. In order to find out what the baseline was, I actually felt that I had to go into prehistory. Fortunately, my checkered career as a student, I have a degree in archaeology. So what I did was, soon after finishing my PhD, I got involved in a climate reconstruction project. And what I did was I looked at cultural changes in relation to climate change in the South Saskatchewan River Valley, the area of the book, or the central focus of the book, for 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. So in looking at that actually the 900-year history, because the book ends in 1891, I got to see what the patterns were prior to Europeans showing up with their introduced diseases.
And that leads me to the politics of starvation. What's that all about?
Well, every Canadian school child has heard about the national policy and John A. Macdonald building the country. Basically, the backbone of the country is the Canadian Pacific Railroad.
That's it.
Right? So we had to join British Columbia, which joined Confederation quite early, to the rest of Canada with a railroad. And on John A.'s re-election, he was, as we all know, he was tossed out for corruption earlier on in the 1870s, but on his re-election in 1878, building a railroad and building a railroad as cheaply as possible became probably his primary directive. In order to get the railway built and to clear the land for the settlers who were yet to arrive and were still being recruited in England and Eastern Canada, and at the same time, or I guess a couple years earlier, as First Nations people signed treaty, and especially Treaty 6, the negotiators at Fort Carleton, where Treaty 6 was ultimately negotiated, the Cree negotiators were aware that the bison were sort of on their last legs, that they wouldn't be able to hunt bison forever, and that the conversion to agriculture was inevitable. Mm-hmm. So they pushed hard, they negotiated hard, and it was 3 days of negotiation. And one of the things that after, like I said, after tough negotiations, the Cree negotiators got a commitment from the government to assist in a time of general famine. So in negotiating for assistance in time of a national famine, the Cree thought they were covered if indeed the buffalo disappeared. And within 2 years of Treaty 6 being signed, the buffalo disappeared. There were a whole bunch of reasons for that, but when, as the buffalo disappeared, the national policy was brought into full force. And basically the government used the humanitarian crisis as a means to control the treaty population, to get them out of the way of imminent settlement, and to clear the land for the settlers that were about to arrive.
So the humanitarian crisis was in fact a period of starvation for the Aboriginal people.
It was a period of managed famine, of starvation, and as I say in the book, there are several references to people dying of actual starvation. Probably more significant was the long period of malnutrition. So for the first couple of years after the disappearance of the bison, the authorities were scrambling for food, no question about it. They had no idea what was about to befall them. But very soon after, by 1882, 1883, food was kept on reserves in ration houses that were ostensibly designated for the people who inhabited those reserves, and food was kept from those people until it spoiled.
Wow.
Under the control of Dominion officials, and interestingly, or I guess sadly, Prime Minister MacDonald at the time was also the Minister of Indian Affairs.
Yes.
So he managed that situation himself. So,
That does, but what doesn't have a life of its own is this whole notion of a policy of starvation used against Aboriginal people here. I didn't know anything about this. And I've asked a lot of people, did they know anything about this? And nobody knows anything about this. Why isn't this known?
Well,
Did you, what sort of, I mean, if it was enhanced, it was in the public record.
one thing is, this could be my, my Canadian historian colleagues. Many of these issues are well known within the Canadian historical community.
Right.
I did not, I'm not the first person to talk about the, I guess, essentially ethnic cleansing of the Cypress Hills and Western Saskatchewan and the establishment of numerous reserves around Fort Battleford. That was written about by John L. Tobias in Canadian Historical Review 30 years ago. Excellent article, quoted it many times. A lot of these issues have been dealt with as individual monographs, as articles and stuff. I guess what my contribution is synthesizing them, putting them into one big story, and I guess we have the product of it. So, and as a policy, well, and again, this isn't my idea, this is one of my colleagues from the Department of Political Science. She considered the subjugation of the Indigenous people to be the unstated principle of the national policy. In order to fill the plains with Euro-Canadian settlers, European settlers, and to establish agrarian capitalism in the West. And ultimately we created the breadbasket of the world, that's the Saskatchewan myth. Mm-hmm. That society is founded on the subjugation, the oppression, the malnutrition, and large-scale death and sickness of its Indigenous people. You know, as a member of the mainstream population, I would like to share the idea that we are a privileged population, that we, as mainstream Canadians, have institutions that were built specifically for our ancestors that undermine the health and well-being and freedom of the original inhabitants of this place.
Well, that's a great reason to write the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.